Let me just ask, if you are here in order to find out what is the best sensor for an automated vehicle, you're in the right spot. However, disclaimer is you have to roll up your sleeve and figure it out together with many other people. Because what this is not going to do, this talk, it's not going to answer a bunch of questions. It's actually going to ask a lot of questions. Because this is what these Edge reports do, to basically look at what is the field in an emerging technology where there are unsettled questions. And so therefore, SAE reached out to me, I want to say like April-ish or something like this. Hey Sven, with Silicon Valley Mobility, can you help us at SAE to get this started? To basically write one of these first Edge research reports that will tackle this topic. And I got great support from Harlan, who is here today as well, who did a lot of the writing of this paper that's about to getting published. And because Harlan did a lot of the writing, therefore it's nice to read and not my English-German mix of language that you might need to torture yourself. So what am I going to talk about? Obviously I start with an introduction, and then this is the structure of that paper. So we're going to talk about sensors for automated vehicles. And it's really like, what are we talking about? What are the terms? What's the taxonomy? And then testing, simulation, and calibration of these sensors. What's important there? Integrity, robustness, and security. What actually matters if you put a laser scanner, like these things over there, for instance, on a vehicle, in a later revision maybe as a production system. And what matters there in order to make sure that they work as intended. And then also in this work, we looked a little bit at data ownership and privacy. That's rather short. And then definitely want to spend some time on conclusions as well, because again, this Edge report is all about what are the questions that should be tackled in a collaborative manner. So let's look into the introduction here. And I took this from SAE, what we see as an Edge report. What is it? It's actually a research report intended to push further into still unsettled areas of technology interest to the new mobility topics. Quite a mouthful, but what does it actually mean? So what this means is it's intended to be quick and concise of overview of major topics. So it's not just like it's spent a year, better 2 years, 3 years and figure out the ultimate. It's much more like this is happening. We have to do something because it's an unsettled topic. And then it's actually fundamentally distinct from the more formal work that SAE does very, very often, which is about standards that many of us know and actually appreciate, such as the SAE J3016 that defines the 6 levels of automated vehicles. So this is intended to be different from that in that sense that it's actually quicker and gives a first overview of what's going on. And it actually comes from these informal meetings, and this very one we actually had on June 28th, not too far from here, hosted by Flex actually, and we had about 20 experts discussing sensors and automated vehicles and really figure out what is unsettled. What do we talk about many things that don't really mean the same? And then it's obviously drafted by someone, but it's really important that we get the comments from all the participants in this expert workshop, again, that we had at the end of June. So it really becomes a collaborative effort. Certainly you cannot really agree on each and everything, but we really wanted to make sure that here's a consensus. But a consensus in a term of this is a starting point. Now speaking about sensors, so that's an image, some of you will know me a little bit better, this is very Sven style, like how he puts things together. This is how I explain to students or to lay people, how does an automated vehicle actually work? And we could spend obviously an entire evening discussing this, how it actually does work and if it's all correct and complete or not. But the point being, obviously, there's a bunch of sensors in an automated vehicle, obviously laser, camera, radar and the likes, but you can call GPS maybe a sensor as a location sensor in a way, motion sensors, speed sensors and the likes. And the important piece obviously, and this is what Harlan and I, for instance, discussed a lot in the writing, you know what, this is the input to the entire automation system. And as Holland pointed out, garbage in, garbage out. If you got shitty sensors, we're filming this. If you got not so great sensors, then maybe your whole automation system is not so great. So therefore, sensors are obviously key. You can have here in your maneuver planning or route strategic planning, artificial intelligence and the greatest algorithms ever. But if the sensors are not good enough, obviously the whole system cannot be as good as intended, which means obviously very often safety implications in the worst case, but others as well. And still, sensors, it's for one pretty big business. So here are the numbers that I these days like to entertain as a consultant. Their forecast, this is from Roland Berger, for instance, projected global market data for automated driving sensors. You can see somewhat smallish, still it's US dollars billion, but it's going to grow in the order of 30% compound annual growth rate for the next 10-ish years. So big business, but still, what are we talking about? And how many automated vehicles are we actually going to have? And that's another thing that I do these days relatively often, like what are the forecasts? What are actually the numbers in terms of total vehicle sales? And here I took a bunch of forecasts from BCG and Bank of America Merrill Lynch and KPMG and the like. You basically see market penetration in terms of new vehicle sales globally and US with the respective colors, where you can see, well, it might be that by 2030 we might have, this is about level 4, level 5 automated vehicles. By 2030 we might have 3% automated vehicles. We could also have as many as 30% of all new vehicles being automated. No one really knows, and that's not the part that I want to discuss here tonight. How many automated vehicles do we have, or when are they going to come? But they will need sensors, and it's a pretty big business, so we better talk about the same thing. One example, and maybe that's a German in me, or at least a Bavarian, I guess, because it's a Bavarian automobile, that's supposedly at the forefront of automation, the Audi A3, that launched almost exactly a year ago, level 3 automated vehicle, where you see here a list of all the sensors they have, or better depiction actually here in the Audi image. And I only came to 21 sensors, and when we checked this image actually with Audi, if we can use it in publication, which we can, they said, but it's 23. I still haven't been able to figure out the 2 missing sensors. Maybe someone can help me later on.
The side mirrors.
What's that?
The side mirrors.
Yeah, but these are like the Umgebungskamera and the whatever thing. But you might be right, yes. There are definitely sensors that are like, oh, haven't thought about those. But you get the idea. There's so much going on in all of this that it's obviously a huge topic. And then we get a lot of this. And this is for a number of reasons why it shows this depiction, which is a comparison of all the different vision sensors, camera, radar, LiDAR, if you want to add ultrasonic to this as well. And then we see all these categories where things are good, not so good, or maybe even bad. And I chose this one because it's from my former colleagues at McKinsey, and I know how diligent they are on their work, and I thought it's not from a particular manufacturer, so assume that it's somewhat independent. And we discussed this chart quite a bit actually in the writing of the paper, and it was really an interesting discussion, Harlan. I thought, like, we were getting like, well, shouldn't this be like more greenish than yellow, and actually 3 levels, is that good enough? And that's the crux actually why we are having this discussion and why we decided to write this paper, because guess what? This is just one depiction, and when I then was like, well, how many can I find? I found 11. 11 of these depictions, and probably the one that you like to use is among them. And the point really is, do they all agree? They actually agree to quite some extent, but not quite. And you can certainly ask the question, range visibility, fair. What does that mean? Is fair like 25%, or is it like 10 meters, or is it like 5.9 volts? So that really needs to be clarified, and that's really the essence of this paper that we say, that is unsettled. We like to say LiDAR, not so great maybe in heavy rain, and radar, you know what, doesn't really get you the contour and shape, you just know there's something, but we need to quantify this better. So therefore, then in the writing of the paper, this is where we had quite some discussion. This is table 1, Harlan, where we spent days and nights to get this right. And we then said, well, everybody can agree basically on these categories. They matter. Good weather, bad weather, range, can you see lane markings? What about poor lighting, especially oncoming light directly into your camera? What has happened? And then I said, you know what, we have to put something into the paper. So we cannot really put something that is getting too strategic, it's a nice term. And we cannot do something where we just say, there's a lot out there and it doesn't really agree enough. So let's just pick one field, LiDAR and bad weather performance. And from the 11 examples that you just saw, you basically find this. It's actually cut off here, unfortunately, but you can, 1G is probably quantity, you can guess that. And a few others, Honda is Honda, Rost and Sullivan, you get the point. And that's actually in the paper that I urge you to purchase, right? They get free food, but not a free paper.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, good.
Unless your company has subscription.
All right. So, but this has been published now, and there we see, if you just ask the question, bad weather performance for LiDAR, you get basically anything from fair, and then, well, bad weather, we don't really separate it out too much, but then some say very good. And then, well, it's better in rain, but somewhat worse in fog. And then 2 pluses versus 1 plus. So this is when we say, there's some work that needs to be done. And then work does not start with testing it. It actually starts with defining what does poor weather actually mean? How should we test it? So we started out, and this comes, especially those 3 categories, or actually 4 categories, stem from this discussion that we had on June 28th with about these 20 experts, like what are the fields that we should look at? And we said, well, terminology is one, and then the others. And what is it in terminology? Why is it that we feel this is unsettled? Because it's really these questions, some talk about active, passive sensors, smart versus basic sensors, direct versus indirect measurements. But what does even that mean? Shouldn't that be defined? This is when we said, yeah, because what someone calls as a direct measurement, others says, no, that's really indirect because you go through different steps. That should be defined. Another example here, what is a point cloud or raw data? When does data end being raw data and become somewhat processed? Is it just because you did an analog digital conversion, or is it that you do an average, or is it that you do some filtering? So when does that actually end being raw data? And also this chain where you say, well, you get a signal, get to data, get some information, there's a feature, and then maybe you call it an object. But what are the different steps? Where does one step start and the other one end? Or another example there, what about latency, update rate, and confidence, which sounds very much straightforward, but the discussion that we had with the experts were like, will probably mean the same thing, but shouldn't it be defined somewhere? And therefore, really, we went into this and said, yeah, that's probably what should be looked into. How do you define those things? And also, what is actually like the taxonomy for these sensors? So, vision sensor, where you can say LiDAR, radar, camera, but LiDAR, is it really vision? It's like sort of like an active sensor, whereas the camera is maybe passive sensor, unless it's like an active camera, time of flight camera. So taking this from steering angle sensors, we're not related necessarily to our automated driving sensors, but where there's a relatively nice taxonomy where you can say, well, it's relative, it's absolute, it's analog, it's digital, you can see for yourself. Shouldn't we have at least something like this? We couldn't find any of this. If we overlooked this, let us know. We are happy to update the paper and even better, become part of the discussion that actually is now starting after the writing of this paper. And another thing really, what even is a sensor? Because if you get some sort of signal here, and maybe a signal is just a light that bounces off an object, and it can be, doesn't have to be like actively lit, it can be that just sun shines on a car and you see the car with a camera. The question is, okay, physically, that you basically convert light into electrons, right? And then maybe you do some pre-processing and so on. You see, what do we really call a sensor in all of this? And we took this from a different SAE standard, you cannot see it on that, J3088, which is related to sensors obviously as well. So there's a lot already out there. We were not proposing like reinvent the wheel, but we would really say a lot of this can be leveraged, but we don't really have this enough for sensors in automated driving. And especially now that we see also sensors on a chip, so that we are miniaturizing things even more, but also building more and more of the processing into the sensor. So this really needs to define much, much more, because it could be that a manufacturer of an automated vehicle said, okay, I get this maybe from a supplier, maybe here I spend a lot of my own expertise, and this is maybe if it goes into actuation or a human-machine interface, that's maybe something I want to get from a different supplier. So it makes a lot of sense, especially in the manufacturer-supplier relationship, to make sure that we are talking about the same thing. Another thing where we also said, that's actually not clearly defined. You find a lot like far field, midfield, near field, and you roughly find the same numbers. But wouldn't it be great if we really talk about like midfield, and we basically mean, okay, that's maybe about 100 meters. Is it even meters or is it feet? The conversion should be simple, but we don't have definitions for all of this, and where it can be that someone talks about a midfield and someone else talks already about the far field, or is it even the same for LiDAR and radar technologies? Are they talking about the same sort of field characteristics when you're talking about different sensors? So then we saw already, these are examples where you see, yeah, everybody talks about LiDAR, radar, camera and everything, but it's actually not clear what all of this is to describe it in terms of the terminology and taxonomy. So that's this part. The next part that we discussed a lot is testing, simulation, calibration. You can read for yourself. And that was really something, well, isn't that in the end a lot of the IP, the core expertise that maybe an automotive or automobile manufacturer has, or maybe a sensor supplier, and why would you actually collaborate on those? Because if I really figure my testing out, I don't necessarily want to make my competitors smart to do the same thing. But we actually said there's quite some benefits in standardizing the sensor testing, and similarly applies to the simulation as well. So one thing really is, because an OEM might want to specify clearly, this is what we need. So therefore, this is a test that we're going to put your sensor through. Therefore, here are the specification. If you could just say, okay, this is according to standard so-and-so, that would help a lot. And similarly, that then a supplier says, you know what, this is exactly what our sensor does. It can obviously be a push or a pull, either a supplier pushes it up to the OEM or the other way around. And it sounds very obvious, but I was surprised in this discussion that we had on this June 28th meeting, where it was like, no, it's not defined. And very often you are in these conversations and you say, well, we want this, again, kind of latency, or we want to be able to detect an object in 120 meters out there. But then like, well, but what kind of object? Well, a person. Well, what kind of person? What should that person be doing, and under what conditions? So therefore, really, if all of this was defined much, much more clearly, it would certainly help a lot the communication. And then also, if you really talk about simulation and testing together, to really fuse this together, you can say we did this in real-world testing, we did this in the simulation, and it's coming together because we know talking about the same thing, or at least we can align the different pieces in different parts of the R&D process. We then look quite a bit at what's actually already out there. So what kind of tests do we already see? And we found, for instance, this image by a company called Raycom Corporation. And they put their radar here, and they have the defined objects there, and so on and so on. It's great. Scientific, technical, probably very usable, where you can say, well, however long these arms might be, but you move this standardized object around, and you can see if your, in this case, radar can track it. But that is not standardized, and even this, it was not like relatively easily found like 10 plus of these comparison charts that you saw earlier in the animation. But of this, we didn't really find many examples. And it can be, for one, that it's because it might be proprietary. But even then, it's something, if it's proprietary, then how do you exchange the data? Certainly a manufacturer of an automobile and a supplier, they sign non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality agreements so that they talk about the same thing. But it would be very helpful to say, yep, that's the test that's standardized, and in that standardized test that a larger number of experts agree is a good test to do. This is how an object does. So that you can actually say those detection targets that you put out here, they should be standardized and how you move them around and at what frequency, for instance, update rate, you capture the data. If all of this is standardized, you can really read a lot more comparable information out there. So that's a little bit about the testing, where we say, well, the standardized testing would actually be very helpful. Then switching to simulation, and therefore couldn't help to put John Krafchick up here because, to quote him, I guess, works well in a presentation like this. He says, our progress on public roads, which basically means obviously real-world testing, is only made possible to the simulation that they do. And we all know these numbers, and that's from the 2017 numbers that they do about 1,000 times more simulation in terms of miles than for real-world driving, and therefore it goes without saying the simulation is obviously very important. Enough said at this point. One needs both. That's certainly what I saw when I worked at an OEM, when we saw, okay, this is what you do in the proving ground, this is what you do in the simulation. You really need both. But again, even more need then to actually align and harmonize the results out of both of them. And the nice thing, obviously, about simulation is, which might be very obvious to many of you, but I still want to mention it, that you can obviously be much, much faster, in this case, roughly maybe 1,000 times faster in the simulation than you are in the driving, and also here that you can do many more things than what you might encounter in real-world driving. But also, let's not forget that you might not see everything in simulation that you see in the real world. An example, when I started my career in the automotive world in the mid-1990s, it was about the time when a certain smaller vehicle from a German manufacturer flipped over when trying to avoid the moose test, and then the vehicle rolled over. And it was in part because of the tire-rim combination, the whole vehicle dynamics and everything. But if you don't really have the proper model for your tire and rim, then you might never see the effect that actually maybe contributed at least to a rollover of that vehicle. So therefore, don't be fooled that you can do everything with simulation. But again, it really needs both, and therefore standardization obviously is all important. And also this point down here, it's almost easy to miss that. An open standardized interface, that's again something, really an open standardized interface for simulation, is that really something going to work? Isn't it that maybe that particular company might be, for the right reasons, very, very proud of their specific simulation environment? Would that be open? We're saying here for now at least an open interface that you can really use the results from one partner, let's say, in a larger corporation and a larger collaboration, and therefore really make sure that you make the most use of the simulation data. So what are therefore the requirements for such an open standard or format in simulation models? The things that came up in the discussion that we had at that workshop, but for one, it should really be like common libraries for these objects, but also vehicles and environmental reasons and so on. Then you can say, well, here's something that's a standardized library for, guess what, bad weather. What we saw earlier in these like red, yellow, green bubbles, where you can say bad weather performance, okay, if there's a library for this, would actually help a lot. Similar, obviously, for persons, if we say in 120 meters, I want to be able to detect a person, also in the simulation world, you need to describe a person. It would be nice if those are interchangeable through a open format or standard of simulation models. Again, that's a little bit of an overspill here. If this is more like the target, this is the environmental situation here, where you can obviously say it's about the weather and the light, but also maybe other environmental conditions that you might encounter on the road, whether it's dust or maybe times of day when we say, what was mentioned earlier, like looking with a camera into the setting sun, that also this would be good to have as a library. And then really those standardized formats, I've also seen a lot of simulations, like fantastic simulation, but the data, how can I actually use this? So if we had a world where there's a standardized exchange of simulation data, simulation results, that would definitely help the development process quite a bit. Don't get me wrong, that does not mean that you exchange each and everything, and this is really where we had a lot of discussion at this meeting, where we said, well, we have to make sure that there's going to be this competition, that you don't say, well, because we standardize everything, therefore we also just socialize or democratize or whatever everything. But I was amazed in a way when we had these 20 experts in a room, how much openness there was to work together. And how much openness there was to say, well, that maybe is something to share. Because even if I might have a little bit of an advantage, if I have the best thing of this, if actually others had this as well, then would actually move the whole field forward more. All right, so let's talk about integrity a little bit, what came up in the second larger topic here, robustness and security. And that was quite a bit. Obviously, you have to protect against all possible types of malicious influence. So nice depiction here with this little icon. But it's really something, well, you can only try to be as fast as the most malicious or most, what do we call it, creative hackers. But still, it is something that we need to address with sensors as much as we need to address with connectivity of those vehicles in general. And it was interesting how we had a discussion about sensor fusion, because it might be something, well, if maybe one component, let's say the radar, maybe gets compromised. Therefore, it's good if you have the sensor fusion and maybe can rely on the LiDAR or the camera. So that's something where we really appreciated the conversation to say, yeah, that's actually a good idea, and is that maybe something where there can be a standard as well, where you might say, well, this sort of fusion helps a lot, especially for security threats. What are the ones that we need to think of? And that's, the list is going to go down all the way to here, but it's not meant to be exhaustive. It's really the ones that came up the most. Signal jamming, obviously dropped or replaced records if there's some data dropped or just replayed and mirrored back. False signals, if you get a response maybe from a LiDAR where actually that was not sent out by the same system. Masking of valid signals, that you don't see your own signals, spoofing. And this was a discussion that we had quite a bit that I was not aware of, I must say. Which is like, well, what if you actually have to get your automated vehicle repaired? And you say, well, it seems like the camera doesn't work. And you get a malicious replacement part of a malicious camera, and therefore you really get the devil under the hood or into the windshield in this case, probably. So that is also something where we might see this already to some extent in today's vehicles, because there's certainly malicious parts on the market. But here, obviously, since we saw for one of the first slides, there's so many sensors feeding into an automated vehicle, and obviously an automated vehicle is highly safety critical. So we really need to think about if that's something maybe an IMEI, similar to consumer electronics devices, that might help. Okay, this really is a unique ID author part and replacement part, so therefore the whole system locks in. And if you're talking about something like this, guess what? It should be standardized. Because you cannot just randomly give out IMEIs, there has to be a system behind it. But also like this clock synchronization, so if the clocks are somewhat off, however that might happen, network timing attacks, that also came up. It spills over quite a bit, obviously, in the architecture of those vehicles, whether it's still the more traditional CAN bus or the flex rate architecture, but certainly something that all fits together. Again, where we are not saying we have to reinvent all of this from scratch. In a way, I was surprised. We had like 20 of these Silicon Valley automated driving sensor experts in the room, and they said, oh, that is a topic. And so therefore, we definitely put it up there. So another thing about the integrity, or this is actually more about scalability. So what happens when all of these vehicles come together? And they all have their LiDAR and radar and other signals, and there's just crosstalk. Maybe you think that this reflection is from your own LiDAR, but actually guess what? It's maybe coming from this other vehicle. There might be quite a bit, so if you come to a crowded area, that they might use the same frequency. We discussed a lot, these are all coded signals, and therefore forget about it. But I was really surprised how, especially in this topic, there was not really that much consensus. Some experts said, yeah, those who are still asking this question, they're not getting it. And others told me later on, you know what, no, it's an unsettled topic, and therefore we decided to definitely have it on here. If we look into this topic and find out in half a year, you know what, no problem at all, even better, we can check it off. But at this meeting, we definitely had, I want to say 2/3 of the experts who said, no, that is definitely worthy of mentioning in the writing and putting it up there, because the risk really is that there's inter-vehicle crosstalk, and therefore obviously it's highly safety relevant, because if you get a signal that's not actually what you think it is, it doesn't have to be malicious, it's basically just messy. Another example, and this is what we obviously discussed quite a bit, where if they are deteriorated traffic signs, whether it's weathered or altered, I think this qualifies as altered. You can see it from my it doesn't happen too much in Silicon Valley, luckily. People just using road signage as shooting targets. As a human, we can probably still use this, right? But here was some pretty interesting research that we came across, University of Washington, where they basically found these things. It's not exactly those signs, but some similar alterations or weatherizations, I guess, where they found there was a modified stop sign that was perceived by an automated driving system as a 45 miles per hour speed sign. Very different obviously stop sign versus the speed limit. Or there was this right turn arrow as an added lane sign. And these are really things where we need to say, yeah, in theory, if these are all perfect road markings and traffic signs, fantastic for an automated vehicle. But we have to deal with this. And it's also something, I guess, what we see in our work, many of us every day, where it's not just automotive industry. Here's, we need to talk to the public sector. We might need to should talk actually to the manufacturers of the paint or the foil, the film on the metal. We might need to talk about, well, how should these signs be different anyways, because we're looking at it with a different wavelengths than the visible light. But if we don't really have a definition or a standard for it, how do we have this conversation? And so therefore it's definitely an important topic. Other things that matter, that came up quite a bit. No, it's probably this thing. And it's really, that's the road where I want to go. That's pretty obvious that that shouldn't happen. But we obviously had tragic events where it was not a road that an automated driving system saw. So mistook a truck for the sky, and therefore tragedy can happen. And I guess many of us agree we're just at the beginning of what can happen. So therefore, that is a very obvious example. Here as well, the mirage, where we say, well, is it water or what is it? As humans, we usually have a relatively intuitive, relatively good understanding. But how should we test and define and standardize this for sensors? And then this here, I had never thought about it. So flashing LED light. This is obviously slow, but we know obviously the brake lights, they are pulsed. And what if the pulse of the brake light is just off with the frames of the camera? So the camera might not see the brake light. And so therefore these are topics that should be addressed. And therefore we said all of those mirage pictures on other vehicles, halting LED lights, certain broken lights need to be accounted for. And that's definitely a topic that we need to think about. One thing that I was amazed and never thought about it in the discussion in June, tires. So we spent, I think, 10 minutes talk about if a LiDAR or radar can detect a tire. I was like, what do you mean, tire? I assume there's a car around a tire. So do they have to detect the tire? And they said, no, Sven, you're not getting it. You're just a consultant. It's the tire debris. It's like really, that's like the largest and the hardest object on a highway that you don't want to hit. Actually, the smallest that you don't want to hit. There you go. And so therefore I said, yeah, makes sense, tire. And then there's also something, well, how do we define tire debris? Testing and also like, can your LiDAR detect tire debris or not? But actually a very important example, obviously. And so therefore, it was really a good discussion that we had at this event. So in overtime, we added the fourth topic because we did want to discuss a little bit data ownership and privacy as well. Because in all these other topics, we were getting into this quite a bit. Like, these vehicles collect so much data, who owns it? And we said, well, we're all engineers, we're not lawyers, we're not ready to have this discussion. But we definitely wanted to collect that information as well, and therefore gave a little bit of an outlook in the paper. And so the questions that came up are as follows. What's actually the vehicle owner's claim to all of this? In comparison, what's the developers or manufacturers, what is their claim? And there obviously it matters. It's not just like, here's an automobile and this company made this automated vehicle system, so therefore they might have a claim or not. There's obviously then different tiers of suppliers that play into it. And it's not just the data as such, it's those recordings. Because if we talk about whether that's for an accident recording device, or if that's for connected vehicles and the data goes somewhere, and this is what we really need to think about from a sensor perspective as well. What are we getting ourselves into? And therefore that's certainly something that should be considered further. Other aspects here that we had, how should those readings be kept? Because it's obviously for a number of things. Great if we talk about sensor testing and validation and whatnot, but we need data for this. And quite some of it might actually be real world data, which some of the car companies are already doing today to actually get the systems better. But still it is, I guess, at least some sort of a gray zone. How are those recordings being kept? How are they anonymized? There's not just anonymizing it or not. There's obviously different levels as well. And what are those alternative claims on an interest in accessing sensor data? So I thought, like, what are alternative claims? What does that actually mean? It's really contradicting. I took it verbatim from the paper, so therefore I'm getting these things right. But then we really say, well, what is it actually if the vehicle owner says, I drove this car, I paid for this car, I was in this situation, I told the car to drive in this area, I own the data. Whereas the manufacturer obviously says, or might say, well, you know what, but we programmed the entire system and we made sure actually that the data is being recorded. Without us, that there wouldn't be any data, so we owned it. So how is that going to be sorted out? And does it actually matter how much the data has been processed? Again, is it raw data? Is it data that is being exchanged between the sensor unit and the vehicle automation or driving unit? That might matter also quite a bit. Where raw data is one thing, but really, there was really that speed in that location and seeing this object, maybe that person, if at some point it can be really identified. At what level does it actually matter who has the claim, whether it's the owner or the manufacturer of the vehicle. Let's see, wrapping it up, summary conclusion. For one, what we saw in all of this as well, where we should go after this, really come up first of all with the vocabulary of standardized, clearly defined terms. I think this is what we saw very clearly in the beginning, where someone says, this is my near field, others say, this is my mid field, or where others say, this is a point cloud, and I think, well, it's really more a one-dimensional data, so it doesn't really qualify as a point cloud. So that really should be standardized. And then also, what are the tests and procedures for verifying, simulating, calibrating the operating of these sensors? So we really came up with this recommendation to say this. And then also similar for security, robustness, and integrity, that we propose there should be some work what can be standardized. And to be clear, and that's a very interesting discussion that I had with John from SAE and the team, it's not just standardization for the sake of standardization. It's really to provide a service to the industry to say, okay, let's get together and make sure that we have the same understanding and not just like, okay, just publish another standard. And then what we just talked about on the previous slide, data privacy and ownership, should really be discussed in a wider group, especially then involving lawyers and business experts and other disciplines as well. So to go a little bit more into detail, because we said, well, after all, there was a lot of work that went into this, but what is like really the terms that we can do? It's really, if we do all of this, we define this and we come up with these standards, it's really to make sure that we have safe products and an efficient data exchange for those vehicles. And that it leads to a platform where we can have these meaningful comparisons. That's really what we wanted to emphasize the most in all of this. It's not just like standardized, it's really, right now the conversation is often very difficult, especially if it involves multiple sensor features and functions where it's just unclear what are we talking about here. Those tools that are comprehensive and are standardized and cataloged, but really important, leverage as much as possible those existing standards because there's a ton already out there, some for privacy, security, cyber security, and testing of maybe advanced driver assistance systems. Not all of this might apply for automated vehicles, but don't reinvent the wheel. And really to make sure that we don't forget that the primary goal of all of this is a rapid progress towards safe and efficient vehicles, which is why we said, well, we don't have all the answers to these questions, but we really wanted to make sure that we get those into the discussion. And here just a few examples of those where we want to look at what's already out there, but also not just say, this is SAE, SAE is doing this, and there are obviously many other bodies as well, such as NHTSA on a federal level, international level. Also probably should have a discussion with ISO to make sure that that is aligned. So that's basically what I wanted to share about this paper, but it would not be complete without actually thanking all the experts who contributed to those. I think I said 20, were actually more, and also quite a few actually who said, unfortunately I couldn't make it to the meeting, but they said, well, please send me a draft version for review. And really thankful to all of them who contributed and made this really a pretty strong publication that is available through SAE. And again, we are not claiming ultimate wisdom in all of this, and really hoping to start off some work out of it to actually address all these questions. What I want to do, this is where all of you are certainly invited. And also, last thing before we go into the question, this was the first time we did such an Edge report, which is about unsettled topics. And we're having discussions where to go next. It doesn't have to be automated driving. It can be connected vehicles, can be mobility services, can be electrification. But really have a discussion with us like, there's a topic that is unsettled. That's something where we should do something similar, which is bring a body of experts together, raise the questions, and publish it to say, well, this is where the work should begin. With this, thanks for the attention. Happy to discuss questions. Thank you.